Hi, this is Dr. Christopher Miller, and welcome to a lecture on early to medieval Digambara history. This lecture will follow Paul Dundas' book, The Jains, pages 112 through 129. Taking a look here on the title card, we'll notice that there is a Digambara Jain sitting in meditative posture, not unlike the meditative posture that we see also to the right in this Digambara Jain manuscript page, right? Where we see here a Jinnah being venerated by a community of laymen, right? So this is a Jinnah, and you can see on the left in the photograph today, we can see that the Digambara monk, not wearing any clothes, of course, because he's the sky-clad, is sitting in a similar posture of meditation in something that looks like that of the Tirthankara. In order to understand Digambara Jainism in the present, it's helpful to look to the past, to look at its history, and that's exactly what we're going to do in this lecture. This lecture will cover early to medieval Digambara history, and the subsequent lecture will cover early to medieval Shvetambara history. Although, as we'll see, we're going to look a bit at the early Shvetambara history, just as it relates to the Digambara history in this particular lecture. The topics that we'll look at is we're going to look at the two basic geographic movements of the Jains after Mahavira's death. This is west and south. This is where we're going to see some of the Shvetambara movement early on, and then we'll continue that in the next lecture. But then we're going to focus on the south. And his bullet point number 2 shows we're going to look at Digambara Jainism in South India, because that's where it went to develop and thrive and flourish in its early years. We're going to look specifically at two aspects of Digambara Jainism in South India to show how the Digambaras really became acculturated within Tamil Nadu and Karnataka, what is today Tamil Nadu and Karnataka. In Tamil Nadu, on the east southern coast of India, the Jains and the Digambara monks and nuns and the lay people integrated with the Jain, with the literature or literary culture through the creation of a predominant amount of Jain literature, Jain epic literature and spiritual literature. So we're going to see how they contributed literature to the South Indian culture and were accepted that way in Tamil Nadu. We're then going to look at Karnataka. Okay, so then we're going to go over to the east, or excuse me, the west. And we're going to see how Jains integrated with forms of kingship in South India and aligned themselves with kings in ways that were beneficial for protection and patronization and so on and so forth. And then we'll also, of course, overall, we're going to be looking at the early and medieval Digambara history, which will allow us later to come into the present. Just as an overview, the Jains moved around a lot after the time of Mahavira. How do we know that? Well, in the early period, when we talk about the early period after the death of Mahavira, the first couple hundred years after, and even longer than that, we see texts and inscriptions that provide evidence, as Dundas points out, for a basic chronology, a basic timeline for how this movement west and south occurred, right? So what kind of evidence are we looking at? Well, we're looking at things that were written down in texts, but we're also looking at archaeological evidence, especially inscriptions. And so you can see over here to the right an image of some Jain inscriptions with the script written underneath and some images of the Tirthankaras above. There are two basic histories that we'll look at here. The first looks at those who will become the Shvetambaras, right? The Jains who moved west to Mathura and VALABHI, those two cities that were places of two of the great councils, the ladies' councils in early Shvetambara history. And then those who went south, who we'll be focusing on mostly here, who moved down the east coast and eventually then to the west in the south, to the Dravidian south, where languages of the Dravidian type are spoken, Tamil and so forth. So we're going to look at that in the most detail, but let us begin by just looking briefly at the move to the west. The city of Mathura, which you see again here in the middle in the pink, you can see Mathura slightly highlighted there. This is a map from later. This is from 590 AD or so. However, we're looking at it here from the perspective of the 4th or 3rd century BCE, because Mathura at that time was a great cosmopolitan trading center. And this is where those Jains who initially went west ended up, right? Jains again became really integrated into the merchant caste eventually, were very prosperous and integrated themselves into society economically in a very powerful way. So part of this, a big part of this at first took place in Mathura, right? And this is an area, as Dundas points out, that is most significant for generalizing early Jain society. And we'll see why in a moment, right? We'll remember, again, that the second authoritative, quote unquote, council that was used, or that was called in order to try to determine what the Shvetambara canon would be, the texts of Jainism would be, was held in Mathura, in this city. So it was a major city where you can only have a council if there's people there to fund it and support it and attend it, right? So Mathura was the site of that second authoritative council. And then, as you recall, there was another one that was in Valabhi, as you see all the way over on the west coast here in Gujarat at the same time. So there were those two simultaneous councils that were held, the second councils, and those were in Mathura and then in Valabhi. So Mathura, though, was the first, because it was the first in the movement west, was the first major center, and then Valabhi came later. A lot of what we know comes from some inscriptions at KANKALI TILA in Mathura, okay, that help us understand the situation that was going on there at the time in Mathura. At this site, KANKALI TILA in Mathura, we find a holy center for Jains, okay? So obviously it's invested with great holy authority and significance and relevance, because there, as Dundas points out, there's a legend that is told of two monks, Jain monks, obviously, who converted a local goddess to Jainism, right? And you may recall from before that there were these tree spirits, the yakshas and the yakshis, and those yakshis and this tree spirit worship culture really overlapped with Jainism in significant ways. In fact, remember, we see in the Samavasarana, we see Mahavira giving his first talks underneath one of these trees, right? And he's often attended by these tree spirits, or the Tirthankaras are often attended by these tree spirits, these local goddesses. Well, here in this legend, we see two monks actually converting a local goddess to Jainism, right? Who, out of her thanks for that, her gratitude, in turn builds a stupa, okay? It's a holy site, which you see one carved here from Mathura, of Mount Meru, as a replica of what is known as Mount Meru. Mount Meru is the mountain that stands at the center of the Jain universe, and the goddess who converted to Jainism built a stupa of Mount Meru there, and you see it here in this inscription. So it became a very significant site for Jain worship. Later on, also, as Dundas points out, an image of Suparshva, one of the Ford makers, the seventh Ford makers, was discovered there. So obviously there was Jain devotion and religiosity and religious practice going on at KANKALI TILA in Mathura. There's a lot of evidence for that, and that's part of what tells us that it was significant as the Jains, who would become the Shvetambaras, are making their way to the west. The inscriptions there also indicate, and this is something we pointed out at the beginning in one of the first lectures, that there is not only an ascetic community that broke out into all these different troops and branches to maintain Mahavira's teachings, right? But there were also inscriptions that indicate that there was a middle class of traders, artisans, jewelers, wealthy Jains who were supporting the ascetic community and their troops and their branches, giving all their various teachings, right? And also just supporting a Jain community in general in Mathura, right? Financially, right? It takes a lot of money to run a good religious organization, and they were, and they remain into the present, quite prosperous and wealthy as a community, but also quite generous in supporting the ongoing teaching of Jain doctrine, right? So, and supporting the ascetic community. So you see that really early on here in Mathura, right? As the Jains are going to the west, and we find this evidence, especially in inscriptions in KANKALI TILA. Also Valabhi, okay? So remember, Mathura and Valabhi were the two cities where that second council was held. So if we go all the way over to the west coast here, now we see Valabhi in that blue section, right, in Gujarat. Valabhi is pretty close to the coast, isn't it, right? This is a port town, essentially, where overseas trading routes intersected, and there were a lot of financial and economic opportunities there. Well, the Jains, being very hardworking and very prosperous as they are, were involved in that overseas trading in various ways, and we'll talk about that more in future lectures. But they moved there, and a substantial part of the Jain community ended up there, where the third council was held. Okay, so there was a simultaneous second council held in Mathura and Valabhi, but the third council, the final council, that where Jain manuscripts started to be produced, as you may recall, to keep the Jain tradition and scripture alive, happened in Valabhi. So that all happened in Valabhi to the west. So the Jains went all the way to the west, right? Why? Well, When we look at the time scale at which this is happening, this is much later than the settling in Mathura. We're now in the 4th or 5th century of the Common Era, right, CE. And what's happening around then? Well, there's the rise of Hindu revivalism, a revival of the Hindu traditions, of the Vedic traditions, of the Brahmins and so forth, under the Gupta dynasty. Okay, the Gupta dynasty was a very powerful dynasty that essentially stood for or authorized Hinduism and funded the production of Puranas and other various texts, which, as we've also seen, presented Jains specifically, as well as Buddhists, as not so nice, not so great, as demonic heretics, as you see written here. You remember the story of Virupaka, the Jain who was portrayed by Dundas in that book, that Hindu text by Dundas, that said that Virupaka had essentially lost all his money to a prostitute, and so he had to convert to Jainism, right? Which obviously isn't true, but it's basically trying to portray Jainism as kind of a last resort for religious life and for life in general. Like, if you have to become a Jain, then you obviously haven't done too well in life, according to those Jain stories. So you can see the persecution that these Jains are up against. You can see that they're really, the Gupta dynasty and the Hindu revivalism is pushing them, right? So they've been pushed now all the way to Valabhi on the west coast, where later on they're going to have to contend with the Muslim empire that'll come in another 500 years or so and onward. And but now it's the Hindus that are persecuting the Jains. Okay, so they've moved west all the way just to get away from that. But they also move south, and this is where we're going to focus the rest of our attention in this lecture. We'll pick up where that one left off in the next when we look at the Shvetambaras. But Jainism in South India is essentially, in its early years, the Jainism of the Digambaras, right? How did that happen? Well, you remember Bhadrabahu, the Jain ascetic, Digambara ascetic, who is said to have led ascetics and eventually the lay community down to South India and remained naked there in the 2nd and 1st century, sometime around there, BCE. He led these ascetics down there, and they arrived to this very different South Indian culture with this very prestigious and spiritual northern culture. And it remained significant there, as you can see, from the 2nd and 1st century BCE for about 1,000 years. The influence of Digambara Jains remained significant for about 1,000 years. They converted people, they had a lay community, they had a lot of ascetics, and they were very influential. This is very significant. Why? Because in the North, generally speaking, when we look at yoga, when we look at Buddhism, and when we look at the Jain tradition, especially the Jain and these yogic traditions, right? There's an attempt to transcend or escape or release the soul from the world, right? The world is something that is binding the soul in this constant death and rebirth, right? So the world is something to be transcended in Jainism, something to get away from, something to get out of the mind, the body, all the suffering. But in South India, generally speaking, there's a culture that loves the world, that loves war, and that loves love, and that loves the geography, and that loves being here, right? So you have this prestigious northern culture of transcendence that is now intersecting with a southern influence that is very much of this world, very worldly. They don't want to renounce the world, they love the world. And all over South India, there's incredible monuments to mountains and rivers and trees and so on and so forth, right? Which has become kind of a pan-Indic thing now. You can find it all over India. But at the time, just imagine that the southern culture is very different from the northern culture of transcendence. It's a culture of immanence, of wanting to be in the world. So the fact that the Jains and the Digambaras were able to make such an influence and integration in the society is very, very interesting, right? Well, how did that happen? Paul Dundas points out 2 primary categories of practice that may have made Jainism popular there in South India. Number 1 is Jains contributed a significant amount of literature in the Tamil language. So Tamil is the local language in Tamil Nadu. Tamil Nadu is the state on the bottom right of this map that you see here, the capital being Chennai, you see in red at the north of Tamil Nadu, but it reaches all the way down to the southern tip of India. So the state of Tamil Nadu is very large now, and it covers a broad part of South India. And they had a significant contribution of religious literature from the Jains. Okay, so this is important, this is significant. How do you integrate with a culture? You integrate with things that they love, and literature in South India is something that they loved, and poetry and so on and so forth, and we'll see how that happened in a moment. The second way that Jainism became popular was in Karnataka. So if you now move over to the left, you directly from Chennai, you see Bangalore, Bangalore being the capital of Karnataka on the west coast. In Karnataka, the Jains integrated with forms of kingship there, with the rulers who would protect them and patronize and take care of them. And that was also a significant political move, but it allowed them to establish influence again for about 1,000 years before they were eventually no longer welcome there. And we'll also take a look at how that happened in South India as well. So let's start with literature. We'll do literature and then we'll do kingship to show sort of how this may have happened. So as I mentioned before, and you see in the first bullet point, a significant portion of Tamil literature, the South Indian literature in the Tamil language, which is very different from Sanskrit, is Jain, okay? And there are two specific important texts that Dundas points out that I'll just briefly mention here. The first is the Jivaka Chintamani, Jivaka, the wishing jewel. Why is this text significant? Well, it has a hero, Jivaka, in it, right? And a hero in South India does all sorts of heroic things that are very worldly, right? And so Jivaka is that hero. He does all the things that South Indians love, right? We love love and we love war. We love the world. We want to be a part of it. But Jivaka eventually renounces all of this, right? This is uncharacteristic of South Indian culture, renouncing in these early stages of South Indian culture, right? This early to medieval South Indian culture, renouncing the world is not something you would typically see. And he achieves liberation as a result, as a Jain would, right? Well, you can see how this story is playing with a genre of literature of fully embracing the world, being able to be a hero, love, and fight for the world, but then eventually renouncing it and achieving liberation from it, because ultimately those types of pursuits, just as in the Vedic world in the north, ultimately just lead to more karma and to reincarnation and more suffering. So the Jains are now showing that, hey, you know, if you continue to live a life of love and war, that's great. You'll have a good time now, but you're eventually going to suffer and you're going to do it over and over and over again. You really got to renounce ultimately and burn your karma. So what do we see here happening in this story? We see, as I mentioned before, a sophisticated ascetic northern ontology, right? This is what Dundas points out. There's a sophisticated ascetic northern ontology of trying to practice austerity and ascetic practices to get beyond this world, right? To free the soul from this world, meeting a southern, very aesthetic ethos. Aesthetic meaning loving beauty and appreciating the world, love and war, right? So ascetic meets aesthetic. Now you know the difference between those two words. In the ascetic culture, you're denying your body in the world, essentially, right? You're trying to get beyond that. With an aesthetic, you're appreciating the mind, the body, and the world. There's a combination happening here. Jivaka, as the hero, exemplifies the Southern aesthetic, right, of appreciation, world embracing, and immanence, but ultimately in the end renounces it, right? So it embraces the South Indian culture and then shows another way beyond. Okay, so that's significant, and it's embraced by those in the South. It gives the Jains some cultural traction. These are very popular stories in South India. The second story is Silapadikaram, the tale of the anklet, sometime around the 5th century of the Common Era. Okay, so in this story, there is a man named Kovalan. And Kovalan, like some of our other friends we've met in this lecture series, has lost all of his money to a wealthy prostitute in his city. And his wife, instead of turning away from him, demonstrates the loyalty expected of an Indian wife, right? She doesn't leave him. Kanaki, his wife Kanaki, does not leave him, but instead travels with him to leave the city where his life is being ruined by this prostitute and also trying to ruin their marriage, remains faithful to him, and even gives him one of her anklets so that he can raise some capital and have some money to start his life over in another city, right, in Madurai. And on the way to the city, on the way to Madurai, they travel with and meet a Jain nun named Kavunti, whose name you also see here in number 2. And Kavunti travels with them and shares all of the experiences of the road, the hardships of the road, the joy of going on a road trip, and so on and so forth. And they all become friends, right? Well, Kovalan eventually gets arrested because he's accused of stealing the anklet, not from his wife, but from, I believe it was the queen. He's accused of stealing it from somebody else, okay? And he's put in jail for that. He's wrongly accused, obviously, because Karnaki gave it to him. He eventually dies, okay? And this upsets and enrages Karnaki because she's been so loyal to him even after he cheated, and she remains loyal. So you see here Karnaki in Chennai in the statue, this is in Tamil Nadu, this statue to this day, holding the anklet, pointing out that Kovalan was wrongly killed, and she destroys the whole city as a result. Okay, so what's the purpose of the story, and why does it help Jains fit into the South? Well, it shows this great story of love and trials and war and people dying, and it's a great story, right? But ultimately, Kavunti says, the Jain nun, as she witnesses all of this, she says, look, all the sexual relations between Kovalan and the prostitute and the attachment between husband and wife has led to so much suffering, not only for Kovalan and Karnaki, death for Kovalan, right? And all this suffering and subsequent suffering for Karnaki, but it's also led to the destruction of the city and the suffering of many other people. What does this all mean? It means go ahead and keep doing all that love and war if you'd like. However, Jain ascetics like me, the nun, and the monks, we gain freedom because we renounce those sexual relations, which are at the root and core of all of your problems. So again, just like in the first story, we see that there's this Southern aesthetic ethos of drama, of world embracing, of sex, of love, of war, of killing, right? But then it's meeting and ultimately fulfilled and completed by this Jain ascetic culture, which offers another way, another alternative, this northern prestigious culture offering another way for one to live life beyond suffering, ultimately to gain liberation. Okay, which brings us to Jain kingship. Jain kingship is the second way through which the Jains integrated, the Digambaras integrated in South India. There was an ancient ascetic rule within the Jain tradition, right, that said this, as you see in the first bullet point: you shall not take alms, food, money, whatever, lodging, from a king. Why? Because kings are connected to forms of violence that we cannot even begin to comprehend. Their job is to protect and to expand empire. They do that through ruthless killing and aggression, right? So ancient ascetics are not supposed to take alms from a king. Well, the Jain Digambaras in South India needed a way to incorporate their culture into the South Indian culture, to be protected and so on and so forth. So what did they do? They allowed themselves to be patronized by these aggressive militaristic kings, right? They had to make a they had to make some kind of concession here because they needed to do that, right, in order to survive. In some of the ancient Jain texts, it says that war is okay in self-defense, right? Even violence can be okay in self-defense. This is called Virodhi Himsa. Defending oneself with violence is okay in some ancient Jain texts. Even though you're supposed to perfect nonviolence, at times violence could be necessary. For example, one of the things that you'll find is if nuns are being attacked, they can be defended. They can either defend themselves or the monks can defend them, right, with violence in return to protect them, to protect the religious community and the survival of the teachings of the Jain tradition in self-defense. And in fact, in the present, now in contemporary India, some Jain nuns are actually trained in martial arts. Why? Because there's a lot of violence inflicted upon Jain nuns for various reasons. And so they're actually being trained how to defend themselves in the case that they are injured, right? So Jainism is not an unpractical religion. It's quite practical. And in this particular case, if a Jain saw a king as somewhat moral or acting only out in self-defense, he would be okay with being furnished alms from that king and defends himself from that king, right? A good example is the Hoysala dynasty, which you see here in the top right picture. You see the range of through Karnataka and parts of Tamil Nadu that this dynasty spread, right, in the 11th through 14th century. The Jains aligned themselves with the Hoysala dynasty, right, the Digambaras did. And that dynasty itself had its origins in a defensive, what the Jains would call a defensive violent act that was suggested by a Digambara, okay? So a Digambara working closely with the king basically said, go ahead and justified and suggested that a violent act in self-defense be taken by the king, and as a result was patronized and protected by the king, right? One of the other things that Dundas points out is that Jain kings, those working with Jains, kings working with Jains, were judged by their moral and their merit, right? So the king was expected to be a moral and meritorious person if the Jains were going to be working with them, right? Not according to ritual sacrifice as a Hindu king would have been. And what that means is that Hindu kings, generally speaking, were not judged necessarily for their moral and merit, but first and foremost, they were kings because the Brahmin highest class of priests in society consecrated them as kings, put them in power, right? So they received their power from the priestly class. Well, Jain kings, kings who are endorsed by Jains, are not just put in place through consecration, but they are judged by their moral and merit. So they have to be kind of good people. And it's hard to be a good person when you're a king because there's so much violence you have to inflict. But that was the main difference, right? The kings were seen as moral and meritorious if they were working with the Jains because the Jains themselves were moral and meritorious and committed to an ethic of nonviolence. The other thing that Jain kingship did for kings, to not be a Hindu king, allowed the king to distance himself from Hindu peasants and villagers, okay? And to align himself, again, with that northern prestigious culture of the Jain tradition. Okay, so there's a lot of reasons culturally why the Jains are aligning themselves and the kings are aligning themselves with Jains, right? There's a trade-off happening here. Kingship, as Dundas points out, is and was viewed as necessary. Somebody has to rule the kingdom, but due to the violence inherent in expanding and protecting one's kingdom, potentially dangerous and flawed. A good example of this comes from a story in Jinasena's Adi Purana. Jinasena wrote this text, the Adi Purana, about Urshaba. Urshaba, as you will recall, is the first Tirthankara in the Jain tradition. Urshaba's son, when Urshaba decides to renounce the world because he's going to become the first Tirthankara, he puts his son Bharata, his son Bharata is then in charge and implores the kings to protect the Jains. Okay, so this is a story about a relationship between a very high-ranking Jain ascetic, Bharata, the son of the first Tirthankara, working with kings to protect the Jains. Doesn't sound like such a bad thing, right? That's how you would culturally integrate. Eventually, however, Bharata later, in selfishness, challenges his half-brother, so Urshaba's other son, Bahubali, and his other brothers as well, for their kingdoms. Okay, so first he has the kings protect the Jains, but then he later challenges his half-brother Bahubali and his other brothers for the kingdom, right? So the selfishness kicks in. Well, what happens? Bahubali, his half-brother, who you see here to the right, being honored at the every 12-year Abhisheka, which takes place in Shravana Belgola. We already saw a video of this. Bahubali fights to defend his kingdom, right? Because, you know, violence is going to have to be okay in self-defense, as we previously discussed, right? So he fights and he defends his kingdom and his brother's kingdoms, and he wins. But then guess what? He says, oh, what did I just do? I just totally destroyed my brother Bharata, my half-brother. He renounces the world. Okay, so here he is fully embracing the world, fighting in self-defense, engaging in war to defend the thing that he loves, just as a South Asian culture would do, or excuse me, South Indian culture would do. But then he renounces, right? So then he takes that step to recognize that kingship is fraught with all of these potentially dangerous and flawed requirements and duties, right? To fight, cause violence, and even kill your own family members. So he renounces his kingdom after he defends it. He goes and stands in the forest for 1 year, as you see him here portrayed in the image of Bahubali of him from 981 CE, right? This is a very old image that is still used and devoted to today in Shravana Belgola. He stands there for a year in the forest, and as you can see his arms here, the creepers go all the way up his arms because he's not moving. They grow up his arms. An anthill forms beneath his feet, and he eventually as he's meditating in this position of Kayotsarga, he achieves liberation, right? So what, again, is the moral of the story? Well, there's the kingship and the South Indian embrace of life and love and war, but then ultimately it is fulfilled by this Jain vision of relinquishment of violence and all of those things and attachments and love in pursuit of something greater, which is the transcendence of all those things and liberation of one's soul. Okay, so you can see how the Jains are inserting them into the kingship culture, but then also there are stories being produced and there are historical moments being produced that show how you can also go beyond that. So let's turn ourselves and just briefly look at some of the early Digambara sects in the South, right? So there wasn't just one Digambara group, just like in the North when they broke out into all the Ganas and Shakas, all the different troops and groups that followed different teachers. In the South, a very important group known as the Mula Sangha, which is a long-standing influential group that you'll still hear referred to today, the root community established itself among the Digambara sects. This being a very influential and long-standing group, it basically said that anyone that does not belong to it, any of the Jains who do not belong to it, have a false understanding of Jainism. Why is that important? Well, if you look here at the Jain, one of the Jain ways to liberation, the steps, 14 steps known as the Gunastanas, which you see in the image here, you can see that the first step on the spiritual path, number 1, where this man is standing on the bottom step and he's almost in the water, is in itself called Mityatva. Mityatva is a state of total delusion. So these early Digambara sects, and specifically the Mula Sangha, basically said that, look, we have the authority, we have got it all figured out, and if you think otherwise or you belong to another sect, you have Mityatva, you're just down on that first step. Very powerful rhetoric to suggest that one must follow the Mula Sangha, the root community, root meaning they tie all the way back to the teachings of the Tirthankaras and Mahavir. And if you don't, then you've got delusion, right? So this name, Mula Sangha, is intended, as the second bullet point points out, to show that this group is connected to some sort of imagined orthodoxy, right? It's tying them back to the original Jainism as they perceive it, right? Okay, so that were some of the early sects. The Mula Sangha is an important one to know about. And then as we move forward into the medieval period, there is something akin to the crisis that you have in the Catholic Church where there's not enough people to perform the ascetic duties or to hold the Sangha together, to hold the group together, right? And what happens alongside with the lay community is an institution of dana, or gift giving, emerges to support the monks, right? Again, so the Jains, very prosperous and philanthropic and wanting to support their religious tradition, start this institution or practice of what is known as dana, or almsgiving, to the monks to support them with food and basic shelter or whatever they might need, right? Lodging in monasteries, as you can see in the second bullet point. However, the most extreme, or the most orthodox, we might say, Digambaras, saw this as a form of decline, because you're supposed to be wandering naked without any support, having a really hard life. And if you start living in lodging in monasteries, you're taking it a little bit easier on yourself. And you have now connections and attachments to these forms of comfort. And if you can't overcome that, how will you ever be liberated, right? So this institution of dana that comes in to save the community is also seen as a form of decline because it's creating unnecessary attachments. What emerges from all this? Well, there's a new institution within, or a new position within the Digambaras known as the Bhattaraka, okay, that emerges in the medieval times for the Digambara and still exists to this day. It emerges to perpetuate what is a dwindling monastic community, so less people committed to the monastic path, to the ascetic path, to being a monk or a nun, less people to hold the community together through religious teaching and administration and so forth. And so the Bhattaraka, you might think of as almost like a deacon in the Catholic Church who fulfills some of the roles without becoming a full priest. The Bhattaraka fulfills a bunch of the roles that need to be fulfilled to hold the community together and to keep it going forward all the way into the present. So we can thank the Bhattarakas for their service, for perpetuating the Digambara community alongside the monks and nuns into the present. So here you can see very clearly the difference between these two groups, right? Here you have a Bhattaraka who's wearing clothes, an orange robe, very typical, right? Talking, giving teachings. And then you have the fully initiated, highest degree monks wearing no clothing, having nothing but their feather duster with them, really striving for liberation in this lifetime. You can see that there's a difference there. And so the Bhattaraka, on the one hand, might be seen as a concession, right? Oh, we have to have this holy person who's not really fully committed. But at the same time, the Bhattarakas are responsible for the going concern and the ongoing survival of the Digambara community. What did the Bhattaraka do? Well, they were responsible for, one, conducting rituals. As we'll see, as Jainism moved into the medieval period, it really began to form elaborate forms of ritual that it didn't have before. Somebody had to conduct those, right? The monks and nuns were not going to do that. They took that on. They supervised lay vow performance, as you see in number 2. So in a way, like a pastor or someone in a church will oversee and make sure through confession and so on and so forth that the members of the religion are living the ethical life that they're supposed to according to the religious tradition. The Bhattarakas did a similar thing in that they supervised the lay vow performance, making sure that the lay people were eating right, performing nonviolence, and so forth to the best of their ability. They also, importantly, number 3, oversaw monastery affairs. Somebody had to oversee and manage the monasteries, the temples, and the places of worship for the Jains, right? If the monks and nuns can't do it because they're not supposed to be attached, and there's not lay people who can do it because they're too busy working, the Bhattaraka fulfills that role in an important way, right? Somebody has to do that. So they're actually kind of a glue in a way that's holding this all together. They also maintain the libraries. Okay, somebody has to maintain the libraries and the scriptures. Remember how important those scriptures become. And they're also responsible for religious education. And today, as you see in the last bullet point, they're most responsible for religious education and publishing, right? And what we're going to see here in this video clip really quickly is one of the famous Bhattarakas in the Digambara tradition, sitting with Dr. Pankaj Jain, who is a professor in the United States, and Morgan Freeman. So he's going to talk to Morgan Freeman and Dr. Jain about the Jain tradition, right? So you can see how Bhattaraka is still doing this religious education and even public outreach into the present. So this is a medieval thing that is still operating into the present.
प्रतिवलोके जैनेन्द्रं धर्मचक्रं प्रबोधो सर्वसंख्यं प्रदायिनी तद्वतिगाति कर्माणा केवल ज्ञान भास्करं जगतां शान्तिं समाध्यादिनेश्वरा. We want the whole universe want the peace, and our motto is peace prevailing. And every human being ignorantly they are the sad, but whenever they will getting the knowledge, right knowledge, right character, then they becoming like Godhood. This is our aim. So every soul is, no one is wicked in this globe. So we must give the good knowledge. When they will understanding the knowledge, they will get the happiness. All the sad is in mind, all the happiness is in our mind. So mind.
Okay, so this is part of a larger documentary series that was created by Netflix, I believe, and Morgan Freeman, and you can find this video clip in its entirety if you want to watch the whole thing on Religion World. The link is there. The YouTube link is there for you. So what else happened during the medieval times? We had the arising of this Bhattaraka position. Well, there was also a Hindu Renaissance that took place, and this is where the fortunes of the Digambaras and the Jains in South India will begin to become mixed, right? So in Tamil Nadu, in the 8th and 9th century, there was a Hindu Renaissance, just as there was in the north, as you recall, under the Gupta dynasty that pushed the Jains further west. In the south, there was this Hindu Renaissance, this revival of and rediscovery of the Hindu tradition, and that happened in the 8th and 9th century. And what it did is it marginalized the Jains, because Hinduism becoming more popular, the Jains were becoming less popular. Their shrines and so forth were appropriated, taken by the Hindus, and turned into Hindu places of worship, or even destroyed, as you see here. And the poetry being produced by some of the poets, the Shaiva poets, the Nayanars, such as Apar, who you see here in the last bullet point, describe Jains, again, here we go with literature, and Jainism as something awful to be involved in, right? So Apar, in this particular poem that I'll read to you, says that he was rescued essentially from Jain asceticism, from being a monk, by Shiva. Shiva is one of the three major gods of Hinduism, right? So Shiva, a Hindu god, is rescuing the poet from being a Jain ascetic, and he appreciates that so much. Calling it a great penance, every day I carried the peacock feather fan under my arm, right? Because he was a Jain ascetic. He had to carry the peacock feather so he could wipe the insects away in front of him. A fool, I whirled about like the great bar of a loom. I don't know how to get rid of the heart that loved the weak and filthy Jains with their yellowing teeth. That's really not a nice thing to say, is it, right? I mean, to describe someone as weak and filthy and yellowing teeth is to overlook the entire institution of Jain philosophy that we've studied up to this point in the ascetic pursuit. But you can see he's just picking at like really nasty things and just not being nice, right? Because he wants to portray the Jains as not so nice, right? He has a religious agenda. When I think of the long years spent in following the contradictory teachings of Jains, I feel faint. When I think day and night of the honey that dwells in holy Ayaru, a shrine of Shiva, town of jasmine groves, I am filled with sweet delight. So here he juxtaposes the contradictory teachings of the Jains and the sweet delight that he gets from this shrine of Shiva. So we can see that there's a rhetorical strategy here, just as we've seen before, to portray the Jains as something kind of last resort, or even you don't even want to be involved in here, as opposed to Hinduism, which is sweet delight in this case. Another thing that happened in South India is that there's a Murugan temple. Murugan is one of the gods of Hinduism, okay, and a Meenakshi temple, and they have images of 8,000 Jains who were killed on stakes, impaled. So for example, the top one, you can see there's a stake. You can very roughly see there's a stake going through this person's chest. They're laying on the stake, and there's a dog eating his or her hand, right? And on the bottom image, it's even more vivid. You can see that they've been impaled in ways that would not be comfortable at all, and they're being eaten by animals, birds, and dogs. That is quite an insult, and also suggests that perhaps there was some sort of massacre or genocide against Jains in medieval India, in Tamil Nadu, as their fortunes again became mixed. However, having said that, it is not clear, as Dundas points out, that there was a genocide, okay? There is no record that this massacre actually took place. The only thing that he points out is that there was a 600-year gap from around the time this would have happened to when more Jain inscriptions were made. So 600 years between this time and the next like regular Jain inscriptions there was that gap. So it suggests that something happened to the Jains. They weren't politically active or super active in society. What happened to them? He says instead of this actually being an actual genocide that took place, it may have instead been a symbolic that the Jains had left South India for political and economic reasons due to this Hindu revival. They weren't actually killed, but it was meant to portray them in a way. And also, as you see in the last bullet point, to portray them as unrighteous, as deserving of death or something along these lines. And the symbol of the stake could be the symbol of, it's a Vedic symbol that pierces through the three worlds, could be piercing the Jains, right? So there was some Hindu symbolism with the stake going through the Jains that may have suggested that this was a Hindu way of portraying Jains not so nicely, but not actually suggesting that an actual massacre occurred, because we don't know, right? And there's evidence that suggests that maybe it didn't actually happen. It's just a way to portray them in a not so nice way. We don't have historical evidence that this actually happened, or definitive evidence in that case. And finally, in Karnataka, so those things were in Tamil Nadu, there were mixed medieval fortunes in Karnataka as well, right? So they were able to align with kingship, but also there was a Hindu revival from a group known as the Veerashaivas, who still exist to this day, who were founded by Basava, who you see pictured to the right here, very respected teacher of the Veerashaivas. Another Shaiva group, Shiva, remember. So there's another Hindu revival, and when there's a Hindu revival, if you're not a Hindu, that doesn't bode well for you. There were Jain slaughters described in Basava's hagiographies in the 12th century, as Dundas points out. Whether or not those actually happened, we don't know, because a hagiography or hagiography is a semi-historical but not completely historical account of a saint's life, right? It's a story that's not meant to be 100% accurate or factual. It tells the story of an important holy person's life. So, but it does mention Jain slaughters, which is worth considering, right? If it's mentioned, maybe it happened, or maybe like before in Tamil Nadu, it's simply meant to point towards and make Jains look really bad. Many Jains, for this reason, converted to Hinduism because of this Hindu revival, potentially because of the violence that was put against them. They converted to Hinduism. So a lot of left, but some Jains still maintained their Jain identity. And even so, in 1336, for example, in the Vijayanagara Empire, they had ministerial and military positions, right? So the Jains didn't go away, and they were very much integrated with society. So we really don't know exactly what happened. But Dundas just wants to point out that due to this Hindu revival in both Tamil Nadu and in Karnataka, the Jain influence, after being present for 1,000 years or so, dwindled significantly. Today, Jains still do live in South India, not as many as we would think. There are some in North Tamil Nadu, as well as on the coast in Karnataka, for example, and Kerala. However, the influence is not as significant as it once was, although they remain integrated and quite prosperous. And we'll talk about that and the interaction with the North that occurs in a future lecture with the Northern Jains. So how do the Digambaras and Shvetambaras get back together? We're going to figure that out as we move on. Thank you so much for joining me for this lecture, and I look forward to seeing you then.